Why are the most spiritually awake people quietly stepping out of society's spotlight? The answer isn't simple, and it isn't always comfortable. To understand it, imagine walking into a crowded cinema where everyone else is watching a film in 2D. They're laughing, crying, arguing about the plot twists. But you suddenly see the same movie projected in 4D, with the director's notes, the actors rehearsing behind the scenes, the cameras moving in the shadows. Once you've glimpsed that deeper layer, it becomes nearly impossible to react the same way as the rest of the audience. That's the unsettling burden of awakening. Carl Jung observed this phenomenon over a century ago, and he hinted that it would only grow more intense as the modern world evolved. What he described wasn't arrogance or detachment, it was the natural consequence of seeing more than what the collective narrative offers. Spiritual awakening, in Jung's view, is not about blissful enlightenment detached from the world. It is about the disorienting weight of seeing unconscious patterns everywhere you look and realizing how deeply those patterns dictate human behavior. Imagine yourself at a dinner table where conversation drifts to politics. For most people, these debates are animated, passionate, even entertaining. But for someone who has spent years exploring their inner world, those same conversations are no longer simply about ideology. They're about projection, the hidden fears, the unhealed wounds, the unacknowledged shadows that people unknowingly hurl into the political arena. You can no longer unsee this. It's like having X-ray vision at a costume party. You're not trying to spoil the fun, but you can't ignore that the masks are only masks. This shift creates what Jung might call a dimensional mismatch. Spiritually awake individuals find themselves operating at a frequency that the majority doesn't share. Maintaining that frequency, while immersed in unconscious environments, drains enormous psychological energy. The more awake you are, the more sensitive you become to the noise around you. And eventually, this leads to retreat, not from disdain, but from exhaustion. Take the story of Leora, a fictional therapist based on countless real accounts. She had spent years doing shadow work, integrating painful memories and cultivating self-awareness. At work, she sat through weekly staff meetings. On the surface, they were ordinary updates, task assignments, polite chatter. But for Leora, every word vibrated with hidden meanings. She could sense the unspoken rivalries between colleagues, the quiet frustrations bubbling beneath polite smiles, the childhood wounds subtly dictating adult behaviors. After each meeting, she left not only tired, but utterly depleted, as if she had carried the emotional baggage of the entire room. Without choosing to, she had become what Jung once described an unconscious processor of everyone else's psychic residue. Now, imagine carrying that burden every day, in every room, with every interaction. What feels like background noise to others becomes deafening static to you. This is why spiritually awake people often describe themselves as aliens among humans, speaking a language no one else seems to understand. They're not above others, they're simply attuned to layers most people aren't even aware exist. But awakening isn't just about heightened perception. It's also about authenticity. Once you've touched the raw, unfiltered essence of who you are, playing social roles can feel like suffocating inside a costume that no longer fits. Before awakening, slipping into those roles was effortless. You could be the agreeable coworker, the dutiful child, the charming party guest. After awakening, the mask feels unbearable. Jung himself confessed to a kind of existential nausea when forced to play the proper Swiss psychiatrist, knowing full well that the profession often refused to confront the deeper truths he had already glimpsed. Think of it like an actor who has spent decades in theater, suddenly realizing the play is rigged, the script recycled, the audience asleep. To keep acting feels like betrayal not only to oneself but to the deeper truths now impossible to ignore. The performance becomes a kind of death, and so many awakened individuals step away, not to escape life, but to preserve their psychological integrity. This is where Jung's concept of the hermit phase emerges. Across cultures and mythologies, the figure of the hermit appears again and again, a man or woman retreating into caves, forests, or towers to cultivate wisdom before returning to society transformed. Jung recognized this not as pathology, but as archetype. Withdrawal is not always escape. Sometimes it is preparation. Just as seeds must disappear into the soil before sprouting into light consciousness, often requires solitude to germinate. Consider Jung's own years at his retreat near Bollingen. These weren't vacations. They were necessary sanctuaries, a buffer against the crushing weight of collective expectations. In that solitude, he carved stone, built towers, painted mandalas, practices that anchored him while he wrestled with the depths of the unconscious. Without that withdrawal, his later contributions to psychology might never have been possible. The hermit phase follows a kind of rhythm, a cycle that repeats across countless lives. First comes recognition. You notice how draining social interactions have become, how much energy it costs to participate in the unconscious theater. Then comes selective disengagement. You decline the invitations, reduce the noise, and search for others who operate at a similar depth. Finally comes return. You re-enter society, but no longer as an actor in the unconscious drama. Instead, you bring a new presence, one that refuses to play by old scripts. But this process is rarely smooth. It can feel confusing, even painful. Why do I feel so detached? Am I becoming antisocial? Am I losing my place in the world? Jung's answer would be simple. No, you are not antisocial. You are following an archetypal path, one carved into the psyche of humanity itself. To withdraw is not to abandon, but to transform. This is the paradox. Awakening isolates you, but it isolates you so that you can one day return more whole, more authentic, more capable of genuine connection. Spiritual solitude is not an ending, it is the beginning of integration. And in that sense, the quiet disappearance of awake people is not a loss to society, it is society's unseen preparation. The ones who vanish are not gone forever. They are preparing to come back with something society doesn't yet realize it desperately needs. So when you notice the friend who no longer shows up at every gathering, or the colleague who drifts away from office chatter, consider that they might not be disappearing. They might be entering the timeless cycle. Jung described retreat, transformation, return, not rejection of society, but preparation for a deeper participation. And perhaps the real question for you is this. If you've felt that, pull yourself. If you've noticed the fatigue of playing roles that no longer fit, are you disappearing or are you preparing? To understand why spiritually awake people often vanish into silence, you have to imagine what it feels like to live with vision that others don't share. Picture walking through a crowded city street. Everyone else is focused on storefronts, traffic lights, and conversations. But you see the invisible threads, how strangers' emotions ripple out, how unspoken fears hang in the air, how unresolved conflicts leak through facial expressions and body language. At first, this perception feels like a gift. Over time, it becomes a weight. Carl Jung called this the burden of consciousness. The deeper you descend into your own psyche, the clearer you become about everyone else's unconscious patterns. The problem, once you've noticed them, you cannot return to ignorance. It's like hearing a constant background hum that no one else acknowledges. You can't turn it off, and you can't explain why it's so loud to you. The very sensitivity that makes you more awake also makes ordinary environments intolerable. Think about a family gathering. For most, it's laughter, food, familiar arguments that feel almost comforting in their repetition. For an awakened person, it's like watching an entire play unfold, where every character is unknowingly reciting lines written decades earlier, lines scripted by childhood wounds, inherited beliefs, and unresolved shadow material. Uncle Thomas's sarcasm isn't harmless banter, it's a shield for the pain of never being validated. Your cousin's constant need to debate isn't intellectual passion, it's a projection of inner conflict. You don't judge them, you simply see them. But that sight comes with a cost. Participation feels dishonest, even impossible. This is why many awakened people report feeling like strangers in their own homes. They describe the alienation of living among sleepwalkers. Jung himself felt it keenly. In his journals, he wrote of the loneliness of being awake in a room full of people still dreaming. His patients echoed the same sentiment. They weren't withdrawing because they hated people. They were withdrawing because every conversation required them to pretend not to notice what they could so clearly see. The exhaustion comes not only from what is seen, but from what is absorbed. Conscious individuals often find themselves acting like psychic sponges. Walk into a tense meeting and they carry home the unspoken hostility. Attend a party and they leave with a heaviness that doesn't belong to them. Jung referred to this as psychological contamination. In practical terms, it means the awake person doesn't just manage their own emotions, they involuntarily process everyone else's too. The result? Profound fatigue. Let's take an everyday example. Imagine walking into a coffee shop. To most, it's a pleasant ritual. The smell of espresso, the chatter of customers, the hum of laptops. But to the awake individual, the atmosphere is electric with tension. The barista is masking frustration with forced cheerfulness. The man in the corner is radiating quiet despair through slumped shoulders. The couple at the window is projecting unresolved resentment disguised as polite conversation. What, for others, is white noise, becomes for the awakened a cacophony of unprocessed human experience. Staying present in such environments can feel like trying to meditate in the middle of a rock concert. And yet there's another dimension to this burden. Once you've glimpsed your authentic self, wearing social masks no longer feels neutral, it feels toxic. Jung privately described this as existential nausea. Before awakening, you could play the roles: the professional at work, the agreeable guest at gatherings, the friend who fits neatly into the group. After awakening, those roles feel like shackles. Pretending that they still fit feels like lying not only to others, but to yourself. And for the awakened psyche, self-betrayal becomes unbearable. Think of it like returning to childhood clothes as an adult. They might still exist in your closet, but squeezing yourself into them is painful and absurd. Likewise, once you've outgrown certain personas, continuing to perform them brings not comfort, but suffocation. Many awakened people describe boardroom meetings, networking events, or even family dinners as moments of inner death. The mask required is too tight, the performance too hollow. This dissonance creates an inevitable pull toward solitude. But solitude here isn't simple. It isn't just sitting alone in a quiet room. It's stepping away from an entire stage play you can no longer perform in. It's walking out of the theater while everyone else insists the show is still going on. That choice often confuses others who mistake it for arrogance or rejection. But for the one withdrawing, it's not about superiority. It's about survival. Jung identified this withdrawal as archetypal. Every tradition has its hermit figures: the monks, shamans, desert wanderers, forest dwellers. They retreat not to escape humanity, but to preserve the fragile light of consciousness. Without silence, without space, that light flickers and risks being extinguished. Jung saw his own withdrawal at Bollingen as exactly this: not escapism, but psychological necessity. To remain authentic in society, he first had to step away from it. And here lies the paradox that few outside the path understand. Isolation is not the end of awakening. It is the middle. The hermit phase is not permanent. It is preparatory. Like a caterpillar's cocoon, withdrawal is the crucible where transformation stabilizes. Without it, the awakening remains fragile. With it, the awakened person can eventually return, not to resume old roles, but to offer something entirely new. But that eventual return only comes if the withdrawal is navigated consciously. This is where danger enters the picture. Withdrawal can become avoidance. Solitude can slide into superiority. Silence can harden into judgment. Jung warned of this often. True awakening carries humility. The awakened individual knows they are not above others. They are simply on a different point of the path. Everyone moves at their own pace. The moment you believe you're more evolved than others, you've slipped back into unconsciousness, disguised as enlightenment. So, the real work of the hermit phase is not just separation, it's integration. It is asking, am I stepping back to recharge so I can contribute authentically? Or am I withdrawing to avoid the discomfort of human connection? Am I preserving energy, or am I hiding from challenge? These questions matter because the answer determines whether solitude becomes sanctuary or prison. In the end, the burden of seeing too much doesn't mean abandoning society forever. It means retreating long enough to learn how to carry the vision without breaking under its weight. It means finding ways to translate insight into presence, wisdom, and eventually contribution. The disappearance of spiritually awake people is not disappearance at all. It is the quiet preparation of society's future guides. So the next time you feel drained in a crowd or suffocated by roles that no longer fit, consider this. Maybe it isn't weakness. Maybe it's the archetypal call to retreat, not to escape, but to prepare for the deeper work of returning. And when that return comes, you will no longer be participating unconsciously. You will be offering something only solitude could teach you. Withdrawal is often misunderstood. To many, it looks like isolation, antisocial behavior, or even failure. But in Jung's framework, withdrawal has always been more than that. It is archetypal, an ancient pattern etched into human psychology. The hermit doesn't abandon society out of resentment. The hermit steps away because growth requires silence, and silence cannot be found in the noise of collective life. Think about myths across cultures. The yogi in the Himalayas, the monk in the desert, the wise woman in her forest hut. These stories persist, not because they're exotic, but because they reflect a truth buried deep in the human condition. At some point, every seeker reaches a threshold where collective voices drown out the inner one. Crossing that threshold demands solitude. Jung saw this again and again, both in his own life and in the case studies of patients who, after awakening, could no longer maintain the old roles without losing themselves. But here's the crucial nuance: the hermit phase is not about withdrawal for its own sake. It is about preparation. You retreat not to escape, but to integrate. It is the psychic equivalent of winter, a season of stillness, where roots sink deeper so that spring can bring genuine growth. Without winter, there is no spring. Without solitude, there is no authentic return. Consider the life of a fictional character we'll call Adrian, a brilliant researcher whose colleagues once admired his productivity. After years of exploring Jung's ideas and confronting his own shadow, Adrian found himself unable to tolerate faculty meetings. What once felt like stimulating debates now struck him as circular arguments driven by egos needing recognition rather than truth. He stopped attending conferences, much to the confusion of his peers. Rumors spread: burnout, depression, a nervous breakdown. In reality, Adrian was undergoing what Jung would have recognized as the hermit phase. For 18 months, he retreated into solitude, journaling, sketching, and quietly working through insights that demanded more space than institutional life could offer. When he finally re-emerged, his research transformed his field. The silence had not broken him. It had remade him. This rhythm retreat transformation return, Jung identified as universal. In his writings, he sometimes referred to those who complete this cycle as border dwellers. These are individuals who live at the edge of society, engaged but not absorbed. They can attend the dinner party, the work meeting, or the family gathering, but they do so from a different place. They no longer lose themselves in the collective trance. They participate without pretending. They engage without compromising authenticity. Think about that phrase, border dweller. It evokes someone standing at the threshold, 1 foot in the world, 1 foot outside of it. This is the paradoxical gift of the hermit phase. After solitude, you can return without being swallowed. You are no longer desperate to fit in. You no longer trade authenticity for approval. Instead, you offer presence, the kind of presence that nourishes those ready for it, while remaining invisible to those who are not. And invisibility here is not failure, it is function. Jung noted that the awakened often become selectively visible. To those who seek validation in unconscious patterns, they might as well be invisible. Their depth doesn't register, but to those hungry for authenticity, they shine unmistakably. This explains why spiritually awake people often report living in two worlds. To one audience, they are ghosts. To another, they are lanterns. Let's ground this in a simple metaphor. Imagine a lighthouse on a stormy coast. To ships that don't need it, it's just a tower of stone barely noticed. But to ships caught in darkness, it is salvation. The lighthouse doesn't choose who sees it, it simply shines. Likewise, the awakened don't convince, argue, or force. They radiate authenticity. Those ready to receive it, see it. Those not ready, don't. This subtle return changes everything. Instead of trying to awaken the masses, border dwellers cultivate what Jung called conscious micro-communities. These are small circles where authenticity is the foundation. Professional networks rooted in integrity rather than ambition. Friendships nourished by real conversations rather than rehearsed performances. Families rebuilt on honest communication rather than inherited roles. Spiritual circles grounded in practice and integration rather than escapism. These micro-communities may seem small, but they are seeds. And seeds grow forests. Let's return to a cinematic metaphor. Imagine a character in a film who leaves the bustling city wandering into the mountains. For much of the movie, we see only solitude, fireside, reflections, storms, endured strange dreams. Then, at the climax, the character descends, carrying something luminous, something invisible to those who never left. That story is not fiction. It is the narrative of countless awakened individuals. Withdrawal is the middle act, not the ending. But we must also pause here, because this phase carries its own dangers. Jung warned repeatedly of what he called hermit neurosis. If the withdrawal is never balanced by return, solitude can harden into isolation. What begins as sanctuary can become prison. When the hermit forgets that withdrawal is preparatory, they risk mistaking avoidance for enlightenment. They stop integrating and begin hiding. They may develop superiority complexes, believing themselves too evolved for ordinary life. They may lose compassion, forgetting that unconsciousness is not weakness, but a stage on the journey. In the worst cases, they may slide into depression or spiritual inflation, convincing themselves they are chosen, special, exempt from human vulnerability. Jung's remedy was humility. The true hermit remembers that everyone is exactly where they need to be. Awakening doesn't make you better. It makes you responsible to use your vision for integration, not escape. To carry the burden of seeing without collapsing under its weight. To honor solitude not as an end in itself, but as the soil in which authentic presence can grow. So when spiritually awake, people quietly disappear, it isn't abandonment. It's archetypal necessity. They are entering the cave, the tower, the cocoon. And if the process unfolds as it should, they will return, not with disdain for the collective, but with a presence the collective didn't know it needed. And so, the question lingers. For anyone drawn to solitude, are you vanishing or are you preparing? The difference lies in whether you remember the return. The hermit's wisdom isn't in leaving. It is in coming back, changed. When an awakened person returns from solitude, they don't re-enter the same world they left. The city may look unchanged, the people may behave the same, but something fundamental has shifted. The hermit no longer participates from need approval, belonging, validation. Instead, they engage from contribution, presence, wisdom, authenticity. And this difference, though subtle, transforms everything. Jung observed that true re-engagement is not about blending back in. It's about embodying what he called conscious participation. Imagine someone standing in a river. Before withdrawal, they were swept along by the current, tossed and turned by unconscious tides. After withdrawal, they learned to stand firm. The river still flows, but they are no longer carried away. They choose where and how to step, when to wade in. and when to stay on the bank. That is conscious participation, being in society without being consumed by it. Let's make this more concrete. Take the story of Marin, a consultant who once thrived in corporate culture. After her awakening and subsequent hermit phase, she returned to the same environment, but not as the same person. Before, she played the role of ambitious achiever, always chasing promotions and recognition. After her return, she stopped performing. She worked with integrity, spoke when it mattered, and led with empathy. Colleagues noticed the difference. Some admired her authenticity. Others dismissed her as naive. But here's the secret: she no longer needed approval. Her presence offered a model of leadership rooted in consciousness, not ambition. She became, in Jung's terms, a border dweller, visible to some, invisible to others. This is why Jung emphasized that post-withdrawal individuals often create entirely new systems. Rather than fighting unconscious systems from within, they quietly build alternatives. Businesses that prioritize employee well-being over profit maximization. Schools that honor individuality instead of enforcing conformity. Healing practices that address root causes instead of patching symptoms. Communities that value depth over performance. These aren't utopian fantasies. They are prototypes, small but living examples of what consciousness can create when given form. Think of it like filmmaking. Mainstream cinema often follows predictable formulas, three-act structures, recycled tropes, guaranteed box office appeal. Then, every so often, an independent filmmaker emerges from obscurity with a vision so authentic, so raw, that it rewrites what cinema can be. They didn't fight Hollywood head-on. They created something different, something true. Eventually, the industry adapts. That's how conscious individuals operate in society. They don't waste energy convincing the collective. They model alternatives, and when the time is right, those alternatives become blueprints for change. This return also changes relationships. Before, you might have tolerated friendships built on shallow banter, or family gatherings sustained by role-playing. After withdrawal, you can no longer fake it. You crave conversations that matter. You refuse to betray your authentic self for the sake of comfort. Some relationships dissolve, others deepen. New ones appear often, with people who resonate at the same frequency. Jung called this the emergence of conscious micro-communities, small, resilient circles where authenticity is the currency. These groups may never make headlines, but they carry a significance that ripples outward, like stones dropped into water. And yet even here, challenges remain. Returning consciously means learning boundaries. You can't fix everyone. You can't carry the unconscious burdens of every environment. You must discern when to engage and when to step back. This is where Jung's idea of engagement without absorption becomes vital. Attend the dinner party, but don't drown in projections. Go to the meeting, but don't lose yourself in performance. Be present, but hold your center. Let's use a cinematic image. Imagine a character who returns from exile carrying a lantern. They enter the same darkened hall they left years ago. The lantern doesn't flood the room with light. It casts a circle, illuminating only what is near. Some people step into it, grateful. Others recoil, preferring the dark. The character doesn't chase anyone. They simply carry the light steady and unwavering. That's conscious re-engagement. You don't force illumination. You offer it and let others decide. One of Jung's most radical insights was that awakening is contagious, but only when fully integrated. Half-conscious individuals often do more harm than good, trying to awaken others prematurely, preaching before they've stabilized. Fully integrated individuals rarely preach. They transmit awareness simply through presence. Their way of being makes new possibilities visible. To borrow a phrase from Jung, your vision will become clear only when you look into your heart. Who looks outside dreams. Who looks inside awakens. The awakened who return embody that clarity, silently inviting others to turn inward. But let's be clear, not every return is triumphant. Some struggle, some stumble, Some never return at all, trapped in the safety of solitude. This is why Jung stressed the importance of integration practices, daily reflection, creative expression, honest dialogue, boundaries that protect energy, support networks of like-minded seekers. Without these re-engagement, risks collapsing back into old patterns, or worse, sliding into spiritual inflation where the ego hijacks awakening and turns it into superiority. And yet, when done well, re-engagement transforms more than the individual. It nudges the collective forward. Jung believed that individuals who withdraw to cultivate consciousness during stable times are the very ones who become guides during times of upheaval. Their silence is not wasted. It is incubation. Their return is not for themselves alone. It is for the culture that doesn't yet know it will need them. Picture society as a vast stage play with most actors improvising unconsciously. The awakened disappear behind the curtain, not to abandon the play, but to study the script from another angle. When they re-emerge, they bring with them new lines, new possibilities, new ways of performing. Some actors ignore them, others pick up the cues. Over time, the entire performance shifts. This is why Jung saw awakening not as an individual luxury, but as a collective necessity. Humanity faces challenges, ecological, political, psychological, that unconscious patterns cannot solve. We need people who have done the inner work, who can model conscious alternatives, who can hold steady when systems collapse. The quiet disappearance of spiritually awake individuals is not the end of their story. It is the beginning of ours. So the next time you notice someone who seems to drift away, who steps back from the noise, consider the possibility they are not lost. They are becoming. And when they return, they may bring with them the very insights the world will one day depend on. The journey of awakening has never been only about the individual. Jung insisted that individuation, the process of becoming one's true self, carries a collective function. The hermit does not disappear into solitude simply for personal healing. They disappear to cultivate something the wider world will one day need. Their withdrawal is a rehearsal for a larger drama, the slow generational evolution of human consciousness. Consider how culture shifts. It rarely changes because the majority suddenly sees things differently. More often, transformation begins at the margins with small groups, outliers, visionaries. These are the ones who step back, experiment, and model new ways of living. At first, they're ignored, even mocked, but slowly society catches up. What begins as eccentricity becomes prototype. What begins as a micro-community becomes a movement. Jung likened this process to biological evolution. Conscious withdrawal, he argued, places pressure on unconscious systems. When enough individuals refuse to participate in dysfunctional patterns, those patterns either adapt or collapse. Organizations lose their most innovative minds to more conscious alternatives. Relationships held together by old roles dissolve when one person refuses to play their part. Political movements lose members who no longer project their own inner conflicts onto external enemies. Each withdrawal creates a ripple of disruption that forces adaptation. This isn't abandonment. It is cultural evolution in motion. Think about it in everyday terms. A young professional burns out from corporate life retreats and later builds a company that prioritizes well-being over endless growth. At first, their model looks impractical, but slowly other businesses notice retention, creativity, and trust flourishing. The prototype spreads. Or consider families. One person decides to stop pretending at gatherings, choosing honest conversations over scripted roles. At first, relatives resist. Over time, others begin to follow, and suddenly the family dynamic changes. What began as one person's solitude becomes everyone's new possibility. This is the hidden role of the awakened they serve as society's innovation laboratory. While the mainstream continues with business as usual, they quietly experiment. They test new forms of relationship rooted in authenticity rather than performance. They design healing practices that address root causes instead of masking symptoms. They explore ways of living that sustain not only the self, but the planet. When society finally reaches a tipping point, these prototypes are already waiting, tested and refined. Let's return to a film metaphor. In many stories, the hero disappears halfway through, into the wilderness, into exile, into silence. Audiences worry they're gone forever. But the arc is not complete until they return carrying wisdom that reshapes the narrative. Awakening follows the same rhythm. Withdrawal is Act 2. The return and the offering to the collective is Act 3. But here lies the danger. Sometimes withdrawal goes astray. Jung warned of spiritual inflation when individuals mistake their awakening for superiority. They begin to believe they are chosen, exempt, untouchable. Instead of humility, they radiate contempt. Instead of compassion, judgment. This is not awakening. This is ego in disguise. The test of true consciousness is simple. Does it make you more capable of authentic love and service? If not, something has gone wrong. Signs of unhealthy withdrawal include total disinterest in human connection, avoidance of responsibility, superiority complexes, or an addiction to solitude itself. Jung called this hermit neurosis, mistaking isolation for enlightenment. Healthy solitude restores energy for re-engagement. Unhealthy solitude erodes humanity. One path ends with contribution, the other with alienation. The antidote is integration. This means continually asking, is my solitude making me more loving, more compassionate, more ready to serve? Or is it making me more rigid, more judgmental, more disconnected? Integration is not glamorous. It is daily practice, journaling, creative expression, therapy, meditation, honest dialogue with trusted others. It is the humility of remembering you are still human, still fallible, still learning. Jung himself leaned on colleagues, friends, and mentors during his darkest times. Even the most awake need companions on the path. And when integration succeeds, the return unfolds naturally. Not dramatic, not announced with trumpets. Quiet, steady, authentic. You re-enter society not to gain, but to give. You bring presence where it's missing, depth where it's ignored, compassion where it's forgotten. You don't force others awake. You simply model a different way of being, and that alone plants seeds. This is how collective awakening happens. Not through mass conversion, but through tipping points. Jung believed it only takes a critical mass of genuinely awake individuals to shift the trajectory of culture. The awakened don't need to be the majority. They need only to be enough to hold space to model alternatives, to quietly rewire the invisible assumptions that guide human life. Like gravity, their presence exerts a pull. Like sparks, their authenticity spreads. Imagine a generation of children raised by parents who refused to perform old roles, who modeled conscious connection. Those children grow up assuming authenticity is normal. They carry it into their schools, their workplaces, their relationships. Slowly, institutions change. Slowly, culture transforms. This is the legacy of the Hermit's return. Not just personal fulfillment, but collective renewal. So why are spiritually awake people quietly disappearing from society? Because disappearance is part of the process. They step back, not to abandon humanity, but to prepare for it. They vanish into solitude, not as rejection, but as incubation. Their silence is not absence, it is gestation. And when they return changed. They bring with them the possibility of a more conscious culture. For you listening now, perhaps this isn't abstract. Perhaps you've felt the same pull to retreat, to shed old roles, to disappear. If so, remember Jung's insight. This is not a sign of weakness or failure. It is a stage of becoming. The question isn't whether you should withdraw. The question is whether you will remember to return. Because your authenticity, once integrated, is not just for you. It is for all of us. The quiet vanishing of the awake is not the end of the story. It is the beginning of humanity's next chapter. And perhaps without realizing it, you are already part of it.